Toward the end of last year, if you will recall here on the program, we did an interview with Professor Yuri Maltsov, who had been an economist and advisor to Mikhail Gorbachev while the Soviet Union still existed. And he defected from the Soviet Union, teaches in Wisconsin now. And we had a very, very interesting interview. And I wanted to take a clip from that because out of the course of our conversation, we talked about why it is communism and socialism always becomes violent. Why does it come that way? Because it promises great things for everybody, to each according to his need, from each according to his ability. Why does it go that way? Let me play this for you.
They need to kill. The system cannot survive without killing because socialism does not have any incentives to do anything. If, for example, I would tell you that no matter what you do, you will be paid the same as everybody else, then most people would stop working. So if you have something which is called equality of results, here in Western societies, we have equality of opportunities. We have equality before the law. We have, according to Declaration of Independence, we are created equal by our Creator. And that's the true equality. Equality of results, however, is equality on the finishing line. And it takes all kind of motives or incentives to do anything. And then, if you are a great leader, then you need to kill to achieve your goals. Because then people begin to work. If you threaten them, their lives, or threaten them of killing their relatives, and that's what they did all the time. So that's why socialism needs violence. It needs coercion. Amazingly enough, that the highest rates of economic growth of the Soviet Union was when they were shooting a lot. They murdered 11 million people just in a short period of time from 1937 to 1941. 11 million. At that time, Soviet Union had the highest rates of economic growth in the world. Because when you shoot people, especially randomly, no matter whom you are, whether you are gay or straight, whether you are Russian or Ukrainian, whether you are Jewish or Christian Orthodox, you can be exterminated randomly without any clue what's left to it.
I guess shooting people is a great way to do it. There was a video that was released on January 11th by the Capital Research Center. It was written and narrated and produced by Jake Klein. It was entitled "Communism Will Always Be Violent." And boy, did it stir up a hornet's nest. So I want to look today at these arguments. Why is it after we've watched country after country collapse under communism and its associated socialism, everybody thinks it's so great and that it's going to solve all of these problems and that capitalism is so bad? Jake Klein is head of media operations for the Capital Research Center, a DC-based think tank, and he produces web videos, obviously, as well as short and feature investigative films. So anyway, you really caused your film is like sticking a stick into an ant hive on a hot summer's day. So what were some of the responses you got? I guess a lot of these people were communists. Am I right, Jake?
Yeah, well, thanks, John. It's good to be with you. Yeah, so we released this video, and normally our videos get 5-digit, 6-digit views, which we're very happy with. And this one just blew up, went viral, and over the course of about a week got 1.5 million views. And so naturally, communists are seeing this thing that says, why communism will always be violent. And they got very, very riled up. So we got, I think, about 4,000, maybe about 4,500 comments. I would say in my general estimation, I didn't count them all up, but about half of them, maybe a little bit more, were communists. And they used a couple points of debate that were really, really interesting to me. Number one, the claim that capitalism is more violent than communism necessarily. And they defend this a number of ways, primarily attributing a lot of things like hunger and war and poverty and things that happen in capitalist nations, but are not because of capitalism, and saying that capitalism was the cause of that. There was also just a lot of cognitive dissonance, a lot of just denial of the real numbers that were used, and their claims that communism is not responsible for the deaths of 85 to 100 million people, despite all the historians that say that it is. And in my opinion, that's really tantamount to Holocaust denial. We can have a debate a couple million in one direction or the other, but if you're going to say it's only a fraction of 85 to 100 million, then you're just denying what all the historians have done. And there were a couple ones, but I think those were the key, most common ones that I heard.
Well, it's funny that we're actually denying all of this when we know that the Ukraine starvation that happened, we know what happened with Mao's great flop forward, as I call it, when they tried to resuscitate it. It's interesting that in communist countries, what have managed to repent at least a little, like communist China, they had to import capitalism to bail it out, when all of their programs were failing. And they're still playing that game because they're worried now. There are more people of other ideologies in China than the Communist Party, so now they're trying to clamp down on Christians and Falun Gong and other ideologies. So they're trying to have their cake and eat it in this case. But let's go through some of these arguments. The death one. Communism has caused what? If we look worldwide, the number of people that died at the hands of their own government, in other words, because of their government. We're not talking about warfare. What are the estimates running? Do you remember?
85 to 100 million. What I gather is the most trusted source on that number is the Black Book of Communism, which is very thorough, edited by Stefan Cortes in 1997, and that estimates 97 million.
And this is, you have to realize, the hot button item today is neo-Nazis and Nazism, etc. But communism managed to do a much better job of genocide and everything else than the Nazis ever did. And it's not that the Nazis were good, but they seem to focus on this National Socialist issue. And by the way, they're both socialists, both of these philosophies.
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually another one of the criticisms that we got, was that supposedly I wasn't criticizing real communism, and that real communism is not violent by definition. And the point of the video was to say, it doesn't matter if it's real communism or not. If you're trying to enforce a fully equal society, that is something that's impossible, at least in this stage of history. Some might argue that Marx wouldn't think we're ready for real communism at this point in history, and that's supposed to be a couple hundred years out yet. But all of these regimes that tried to bring about communism, they were socialists. And bringing about communism through socialism is impossible without violence because people won't give up their stuff voluntarily.
Right, they won't. So I'm assuming that all of this in between, this is collateral damage that has to happen to get us to the great utopia. That's what Yuri Maltsov said. They just view this as, yes, in 100 years, 200 years, we'll arrive at the great perfectible Marxism, but in the meanwhile, we have all this collateral damage, and it just has to happen for the greater good.
Yeah, and some communists in the comments were more honest than others. Some said, yes, we will have to use violence, and we're coming for you. I wish them luck with that. I can talk about how disturbing the numbers are for support for socialism and communism, which, again, in practice are the same thing because socialism is the tool to bring about communism. Those numbers amongst young people today are really, really disturbing, but it's just not possible.
Why is it alive? Before we get to one of the other responses that you did to all of these emails that come in your mind, why is Marxism alive and well on American college campuses? Is it because it's the idealized, romanticized version of it? And then all the students that come through that get told it's such a great thing, they don't know its history.
That's a really great question. I'm a fairly recent college graduate. I graduated about 4 years ago, and I knew lots of self-described socialists or, ultra progressives that, even if they wouldn't define themselves as socialists, were socialist in practice. And I think it's a couple of factors. I think number one is poor education on the issue. Because my generation is not, and the younger generations didn't grow up during the Cold War, we weren't constantly fed information about what was going on in the Soviet Union and communist China and other nations. We still hear about North Korea, but we kind of consider that an outlier, and it sort of is for a couple of reasons. So I think number one, we really need better education in high school, even grade school, about what happened in these countries, and more specifically, how communist ideology led that to happen. And that's reason number two why I think young people believe in these ideas is because they don't see the link between the violence that happened attempting to achieve communism and communism or socialism in theory. And that's the common refrain. Communism is good in theory, but not in practice. And I think that's sloppy thinking. I think anything that's bad in practice must be bad in theory, because then the theory doesn't work. Theory is only so good insofar as it can describe reality. And so, I think that they believe socialism means Scandinavia and Western Europe and nations with large welfare states. And to a certain extent, actual socialists, groups like Democratic Socialists of America, which have seen massive rises in their membership since the Bernie Sanders campaign. I think they went from like 5,000 to over 32,000 members, are capitalizing on the fact that a lot of young people don't understand what socialism and communism actually is to get them to support it. And just to be very clear, Scandinavia and Western Europe, I don't like their welfare state policies. I think they're bad, but they're not socialist. They're social democracies. And, even capitalist economist F.A. Hayek said a small, restrained social insurance programs, a la what they have in Scandinavia or we have here in the form of like Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, can be compatible with capitalism so long as they can't endlessly grow. And so they're not socialism, and they need to be better educated about what socialism is and isn't, and how socialism caused what happened in all of these communist nations.
I will have to say that I'm always amazed how agendas and philosophies and religions that fail in certain areas can keep rolling forward despite the failure. And by the way, this is when a worldview collapses, which is why I'm watching the whole Western paradigm right now to see which way it goes. It tends to go through three stages as it goes on the way out. The first one is that when there is opposition that starts to build to it, is just mild poo-pooing. Oh, you poor person, you just don't understand. As the opposition builds and the evidence against the worldview builds, it's violent reaction. And that's what you're seeing right now. The two reactions that they can only do after that are to shut up the people by killing them, imprisoning them, shutting down freedom of speech. But it's a violent reaction against the people who are opposing their agendas. And they also, number two, double down on it. So they try to shut up the critics, imprison them, kill them, marginalize them, censor them, whatever has to happen, and then they double down on the thing to make it go more. That's part of the violent stage two. Stage three is the whole thing just falls apart like the former Soviet Union. And then people say, well, how could we have been so stupid to have believed in that in the first place? So anyway, we're talking to Jake Klein right now. He is head of media operations for the Capital Research Center, a DC-based think tank. And prior to working for CRC, he worked for a subsidiary of DreamWorks and the Ayn Rand Institute. CapitalResearch.org is their site. We'll be back. We're at SteelOnSteel.com. I'm John Loeffler. The program is Steel on Steel. In addition to doubling down, which is what Marxists have done since the beginning of Marxism when caught in the malfeasance of their own misdeeds, is not only do they double down, then they project. They take what it is they know, the dirty deeds they know they would be doing to you, and project them upon you and accuse you of them. Remember that during the Cold War? They were always accusing us of exactly what it was they were doing. Welcome back to Steel on Steel. John Loeffler here with you. And Jake Klein's our guest right now, head of media operations for the Capital Research Center in Washington, D.C., capitalresearch.org. What about the allegation that capitalism causes poverty and hunger and communism leaves them? And I should point out, too, Jake, that what they do when they make these arguments is they compare us to a utopia which has never existed and point out how far we fall from it, rather than comparing what we've done with free markets to everybody else who didn't.
Yeah, I agree with what you just said completely, and I think that was my main point. Now, I have one image in front of me, and if your listeners want to go read the article, they can see more. But it's an image created by communists, and it says the annual human cost of capitalism. It's got some beautiful graphic design. 8 million die from lack of clean water. Over 7 million die of hunger. Over 3 million die of curable diseases. 500,000 die of malaria. In other words, 20 million easily preventable deaths annually. The problem with this is exactly what you just said. They're comparing utopia, a world in which we have no scarcity, no problem of resources, and thinking that that's what communism will bring about. And again, it's an education problem. That's really, at its most fundamental level, what economics is and why we need economics to understand the world, because economics is the study of scarcity and how we deal with the issues of scarcity. And so what they're doing is they're taking things that were just the state of nature for humanity for thousands of years and attributing that to capitalism. What needs explaining is not poverty. That's the state of nature. What needs explaining is how we became so wealthy. And we have become incredibly wealthy. I have a chart in my article showing GDP since the year zero to the year 2015 is about 0 billion in the year zero and is over 100 trillion in 2015. And most of that happened between about the year 1700 and now. And I shouldn't need to convince Marxists that capitalism is responsible for that, because even Marx believed that. Marx thought capitalism was a great system for accumulating wealth. He just wanted it to be replaced by socialism at a certain point in history when it went too far. And most socialists today would say we're at that point in history. Whether Marx himself would agree with that, I don't know.
No, it's really important because you have to recognize everything that we produce is difficult to do, whether it's growing your food or generating energy. You have to really work at this. And in some places, it's harder to do it than in others. So like you say, poverty and disease and limited resources are the norm of what we are born into. What we have done with capitalism, and it's a Western phenomenon, has been to make that easier and more abundant and more proficient, till the point that people come to assume that that's the norm. And as you said, it's not the norm. We've been able to make it work. So I guess what's really interesting is you see this stuff playing out every day on Capitol Hill and in a lot of state legislatures, where you basically have two different worldviews and they're pulling back and forth on each other, trying to get control, which is why we never seem to make any progress anywhere. But in California now, they have a state that's, I think, racing Illinois to the bottom of bankruptcy. And yet now that we have the, say, for example, the tax cut that just went through, they want to put a surtax on taxing the tax cut to businesses. At the same time, businesses are fleeing the state, Jake, and they can't understand why their revenues are imploding. It's really strange. In Europe, when they were doing that, remember when Ireland dropped its capital gains rate substantially and everybody flooded from France over to Ireland to work because they made it so much better? The French were going, well, that is not fair. We need tax normalisation. Tax normalization means everybody needs to charge the same tax. They don't learn the lesson, though. That's the funny part about this.
Yeah, this is an aside, but I know so many progressives who are just so mad about the corporate tax rate being lowered. The same people who think Western Europe and Scandinavia is so much better. Countries that have had way lower corporate tax rates than we had before our new tax reform bill. They also just don't seem to understand that, this is a controversial claim, I suppose, but corporations are people. Literally, it's a way in which people combine to operate a business. And any profits that a company makes is paid by the people who work for it and run it and its stakeholders. The notion that we would need a corporate tax to tax people is ridiculous. If you want to tax the rich, which I don't particularly want to overly tax the rich, but if you do it in the individual income tax, don't do it in the corporate income tax, which stops businesses from wanting to set up in America to begin with.
Right. We've trapped a lot of money overseas. People forget that people that invest in businesses are little moms and pops that use that investment for retirement income. I always point out that corporations really don't pay income tax. You pay the tax, Jake. They just pass it on to their clients, whatever the business is.
Yeah, exactly. I think Milton Friedman did some analysis on that a number of years ago to show that tax increases end up split. And obviously they can make some businesses just not economically viable anymore. But even if they remain economically viable, a huge share of that is passed on to the consumer. And then it's the low-income people that progressives most want to help, and I most want to help, and I think everybody most wants to help, that end up paying the burden.
Yeah, and then that lugs everything else, which makes the cost of doing everything else bigger, and then that just creates the inflationary situation. It's really bizarre that we keep going around and around in these, but as I've said, the reason we can't oftentimes get set on a concrete path is you have this ideology pull back and forth in the lawmaking bodies. Then, of course, democracy or Republican form of government like we have is a process of compromise, and so nothing really happens, unlike what we just went through. The ultimate result of this remains to be seen. As money is repatriated, will more and more jobs be created?
To bring it back to the communism issue, whether it's about this or whether it's about that, it really just goes to show that education is the issue and what needs to be fixed. And there's some really great organizations that are doing that. We at the Capital Research Center are helping, but there's also the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, which does really great work on this. But we really need economic education. I don't expect everybody who's educated on these issues to necessarily agree with us, but to not say the utterly ignorant things that they've said about tax reform or that they've said about communism. If we could just get economics as like a mandatory class in high school, I think it would fix so much of all of this.
Well, yes, assuming that you don't have Marxist professors.
That's another problem. 1 in 5 professors self-identify as Marxists. But it's much, much better in economics departments. Marxism is way, way, way on the fringe in economics. And also just in terms of left to right balance of professors, it's really terrible in universities. It's like 1 to 20 conservative or libertarian or right-wing professors to 20 progressive or socialist or whatever left-wing professors. But in economics departments, it's a lot closer. I think it's like 2 to 5 or something like that.
Yeah, no, you're right. And when they say it's not real communism, my bottom line is, well, we've already whapped off 100 to 130 million people trying to get to the real communism. How many more are you willing to throw on the table?
I think my real point that I tried to make in this video is it doesn't matter if it's real communism or not. It wasn't real communism. They called themselves the communist parties of all of these countries. But, one of the S's in USSR was socialist. If you read Lenin, what they were talking about was, instituting socialism and a dictatorship of the proletariat to bring about communism. The point being, it doesn't matter if it was real communism or not, because real communism is impossible at this point in history. You can attempt to bring it about as much as you want, but the only way to continue to fight against the facts of reality is violence, and eventually that's going to crumble.
Yeah. Even Joseph Smith tried it. Remember that with the Mormons? I think they tried it twice, and that all fell apart. It really goes against the nature of mankind in that most people act in their own economic self-interest. And so if they don't feel they're getting something out of the deal, there are a bunch of people willing to coast along. You have some producers, some non-producers, and you can see where the whole thing distorts very rapidly. It ignores human nature is what it does, and economic nature. So, all right, Jake Klein, head of media operations for the Capital Research Center, which is a DC-based think tank. Your website, capitalresearch.org, and the video, if they want to search it and watch it, it's just about 3 minutes on YouTube. What should they look for?
Why Communism is Always Violent. You can find it on YouTube or on our Facebook page, which is Capital Research Center.
Do you have a blog, by the way?
I do not personally, but I also run our film project here at the Capital Research Center. So you can go to dangerousdocumentaries.com, which is all me, or else just follow Capital Research Center, go to capitalresearch.org, follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and you'll see my writing there along with all of our other authors.
Thanks, Jake.
All right. Thank you.